안녕하십니까. 대전시립미술관장 선승혜입니다. 대전비엔날레 2020 인공지능 국제 콜로키움을 개최하게 되어 매우 기쁩니다. 오늘 국제 콜로키움에 참석해 주신 연사 여러분들께 진심으로 감사드립니다. 그리고 온라인으로 만나뵐 많은 청중 여러분들께도 반가운 마음과 더불어서 감사를 드립니다. 이번 국제 콜로키움은 인공지능과 사람이 예술을 통해서 어떻게 공진화할 것인가를 찾아보는 자리가 되었으면 좋겠습니다. 감사합니다. It is my great honor to host the International Colloquium of Daejeon Biennale 2020 Artificial Intelligence. I would love to express my heartfelt appreciation to the great speakers today. And then I welcome the audience through the online. I hope it could be the best opportunity to explore the future of human beings with artificial intelligence. Thank you so much. Please enjoy our colloquium.
안녕하세요. 카이스트 학술문화원장 문수복입니다. 대전 비엔날레 2020 AI 국제 콜로키움 개최를 축하드립니다. 올해의 비엔날레에서는 AI와 예술이라는 화두를 통해 AI가 우리에게 던지는 문화적 그리고 나아가 존재적 의미를 살펴보게 됩니다. IT 강국에서 2030년 AI 강국으로 나아가야 하는 지금 기술만이 아니라 그 기술이 가져다 주는 문화적, 사회적 충격을 대전 비엔날레를 통해 이해하고 흡수하고 진화의 방향을 짚어보려고 합니다. 코로나로 인한 온택트 상황에서도 좋은 연사분들을 모시고 이런 멋진 행사를 준비하신 대전시립미술관 선승혜 관장님과 직원분들께 깊이 감사드립니다. 뵙기 힘든 연사분들의 흥미진진한 강연에 저도 큰 기대를 하고 있습니다. 많은 관심과 시청 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
안녕하십니까. 대전시립미술관장 선승혜입니다. 오늘 국제 콜로키움에서는 인공지능 감정 예술에 대해서 발표하겠습니다. 인공지능은 지극히 기계적인 세상이지만 또한 인간적인 세상이기도 합니다. AI의 전략은 인간의 감정, 문화, 예술과 함께 가야 됩니다. 이 시점에서 인공지능과 예술의 관계에 대한 성찰은 곧 인간의 성찰이기도 합니다. 오늘 저의 발표는 먼저 시각예술, 대전시립미술관 인공지능 비엔날레의 전시에 초점을 맞춰서 소개를 하고 다음으로는 인공지능의 시각예술과 결합이 되는 텍스트 그리고 음악에 대해서 발표하고자 합니다. AI에게 아름다움, 감정, 느낌, 패턴을 학습시킬 수가 있습니다. 이제 감정 AI는 아름다움도 알고, 감정도 알고, 느낌도 알고, 굉장히 풍부한 인간의 마음을 가진 AI로 발전할 수가 있습니다. AI와 예술이 어떻게 만나고 있을까요? 바로 다원예술입니다. 고전적인 예술의 분류가 문학, 조각, 시, 건축과 같은 것이었다면 그리고 문화, 기관이 미술관, 공연장과 같은 것이 20세기의 문화 제도였다면 21세기는 완전히 바뀔 것입니다. 바로 디지털이 예술의 무대가 되고 예술의 현장이 될 것입니다. 디지털이 문화, 예술의 현장이 되는 이 시점에서 우리들의 모든 일상은 바로 문화예술이 될 것입니다. 그리고 AI가 활약하는 장소가 되기도 합니다. 인공지능이 일상 속으로 들어옵니다. AI가 예술을 만났을 때 바로 우리들의 일상은 예술이 됩니다. 인공지능은 현실을 바꿉니다. 가상현실, 증강현실, 확장현실과 같은 새로운 현실이 우리들의 일상이 됩니다. 이제 그 현실은 우리가 경험하는 디지털 세계입니다. 5G가 상용화될수록 실시간으로 시차 없이 가상현실의 디지털 세계가 전 세계 사람들과 공유될 것입니다. 대전 비엔날레 2020 인공지능 햇살은 유리창을 잃고는 예술가들이 인공지능을 이해하고 표현하는 방식을 4가지로 분류했습니다. 첫 번째는 인지, 두 번째는 태도, 세 번째는 오류, 그리고 4번째는 새로운 동반자로서의 인공지능입니다. 예술가가 관심을 가지는 인공지능은 감정을 포함합니다. 요나스 룬드가 중요한 타자에서 말하듯이 인공지능이 인간의 감정을 알 수 있을까라는 질문으로 시작합니다. 그러면 과연 인공지능에게 AI를 학습시켜야 할까요? 말까요? 인간에게 최적화된 AI를 만들려면 감정을 인공지능에 학습시켜야 한다고 주장하고자 합니다. 단순히 생각하면 심리학자들이 감정지능, Emotional Intelligence를 연구해 왔기 때문에 인공지능에게 감정지능을 학습시킨다는 것도 가능하다라는 전제를 설정할 수가 있습니다. 사람의 감정 패턴이 굉장히 개인적인 것 같지만 실은 인류 공동의 감정 패턴이 있다라고 생각합니다. 여전히 사람들의 마음을 움직이는 것은 그 감정 패턴이며 그 패턴은 역사적으로 공유되어 왔습니다. 그렇다면 많은 감정 패턴 중에서 어떤 것을 인공지능에게 학습시켜야 할까요? 저는 여기에서 동아시아에서 그리고 한국에서 가장 많이 공유되어 왔던 윤리 감정으로서의 4단, 그리고 인간의 감정으로서의 7가지 감정 7정을 제안하고자 합니다. 4단의 윤리 감정은 첫 번째로는 힘든 사람을 배려하는 측은지심, 그리고 두 번째로는 올바름과 그렇지 않음을 구별하는 시비지심, 세 번째는 나쁜 행동과 나쁜 행동을 부끄러워하는 수호지심, 그리고 마지막은 겸손하게 자기를 낮출 수 있는 사양지심으로 나누어집니다. 감정 AI에게 측은, 수호, 시비, 사양지심을 마음을 학습시킵니다. 그러면 감정 AI는 측은한 것에 공감하는 공감력을 가지게 되고 옳고 그름을 판단하는 분별력을 가지게 되고 나쁜 것을 부끄러워하는 반성력을 가지게 되고 자신을 낮추는 겸손함까지 겸비하게 됩니다. 그렇다면 이러한 4가지 윤리 감정을 학습한 인공지능은 윤리적인 군자형 인공지능이 가능할 것입니다. 그리고 다음으로는 조금 더 인간의 마음속에 있는 복잡 다단한 감정을 살펴보고자 합니다. 인간의 감정은 언어로 표현할 수 있는 것과 언어로 표현할 수 없는 것의 여러 가지 모호함들이 그 특징입니다. 그런데 저는 여기에서 주요한 인간의 감정으로서 7가지 감정을 제안하고자 합니다. 이것은 역사적으로 유학, 성리학, 그리고 우리나라의 주자학, 우리나라의 성리학에서 우리나라 성리학에서 토론되어 왔던 것들입니다. 첫 번째로는 히로에락 애호욕 혹은 히로에구 애호욕이라고 합니다. 기쁨, 기쁨, 히로, 분노, 슬픔, 그리고 락, 즐거움 혹은 두려움이 들어가기도 합니다. 사랑, 증오, 그리고 마지막에 욕망, 이렇게 7가지 감정입니다. 다시 말씀드리면 기쁨, 분노, 슬픔, 두려움, 사랑, 증오, 그리고 욕망입니다. 인간의 감정은 인간의 무의식과 아주 밀접하게 결합되어 있습니다. 특히 히로에락 애호욕 중에 마지막 욕망은 인간의 감정을 움직이는 강력한 동력, 에너지가 되기도 합니다. 이성이나 도덕성이 감정보다 우월하다라든가 감정보다 더 합리적이다라고 하는 것은 인류 문명이 발전시켜 온 사고체계입니다. 그러나 인간을 무너뜨리는 것은 이성과 도덕감이 아닙니다. 바로 감정 그 자체입니다. 여기에서 왜 우리가 인공지능에게 감정을 학습시켜야 하는가라는 이유도 인간을 무너뜨릴 수 있는 강력한 힘이 있기 때문입니다. 인간이 기쁠 때, 화났을 때, 슬플 때, 분노할 때, 사랑할 때, 증오할 때, 바로 이런 감정의 소용돌이에 있을 때 감정을 학습한 인공지능의 지혜를 더한다면 그 한마디의 반응이, 한마디의 대응이, 한마디의 그 한 걸음이 사람에게 또 다른 그 안정, 사람에게 그 자기의 복잡 다단한 감정을 관조할 수 있는 힘을 생기게 합니다. 감정 AI에게 사람의 7가지 감정을 학습시킨다는 것, 그 중에서도 기쁨이라든가 즐거움이라든가 사랑과 같은 긍정적인 감정을 학습시킨다면 사람의 마음을 굉장히 쉽게 사로잡을 것입니다. 인공지능에게 분노, 공포, 그리고 슬픔과 같은 어떻게 보면은 부정적인 감정을 학습시킨다면 사람이 바로 인공지능에게 사람의 가장 감정과 마음의 약점을 내어주게 됩니다. 상상만 해도 아찔한 인공지능의 감정 연구는 바로 시작되어야 합니다. 다음은 이러한 감정을 학습한, 감정을 이해한, 인공지능이 가능하다면 그 다음 예술에서는, 특히 시각예술에서는 어떤 것이 벌어질까요? 시각예술은 블랙스완과 같습니다. 실제로 전혀 일어나지 않을 것 같은 것들이 눈으로 보이게 만드는 놀라운 예술입니다. 인간의 감각 기능은 70% 이상이 시각으로 전달된다고 알려져 있습니다. 시각예술은 고고한 유토피아, 잔혹한 삼라만상, 그리고 평범한 일상의 풍경, 그리고 사람이 보고 느낀 감정, 구상이든 추상이든 이것을 눈에 보이게 만든 예술 세계입니다. 그리고 때로는 이것은 가상현실이라고 불려지기도 합니다. 인공지능에게 인간의 그리고 예술가의 미적 가치, 감정 패턴, 창작의 패턴을 학습시킨다면 바로 인공지능은 인간의 예술가적 알고리즘을 탑재한 놀라운 창작을 해낼 것입니다. AI는 이미 사람이 평생을 다 보아도 볼 수 없는 이미지들을 보고 있습니다. AI가 수억만 장의 이미지를 본다는 그 시간도 극적으로 아주 짧아지고 있습니다. 특히 많은 공학자들이 얘기하는 초고속 시력이 상용화된다면 AI는 나노와 같이 짧은 시간 안에도 인간이 만들어낸 수없는 엄청난 양의 이미지를 학습할 것입니다. 바로 예술 AI의 학습 자료는 이런 시각 예술이고 이런 시각 이미지는 이미 온라인을 통해서 전 세계에서 공유되고 있습니다. 2019년 도나루가 AI가 몇 분 안에 명작을 창작할 수 있다라는 논문의 제목처럼 이제는 이미 AI가 이미지를 생성하고 있으며 그것이 인간의 감정을 얼마만큼 탑재하고 인간의 감정을 움직일 수 있을까라는 단계에 와 있을지도 모릅니다. AI에게 이 미술 이미지, 기존의 미술의 이미지를 학습시키는 과정에 있습니다. 인간의 문명이 만들어낸 이런 시각예술로서의 미술은 인간의 감정들을 이미 시각적으로 보여준 데이터입니다. 그리고 또한 그 명작으로 살아남은, 명작으로 전해지는 예술들은 양질의 데이터라고 말씀드릴 수도 있습니다. 미국의 주요 미술관의 소장품이 고화질 이미지와 데이터를 대량으로 공유하는 오픈 억세스가 이미 실행된 지 오래입니다. 2020년 미술관의 오픈 데이터 소스를 제가 한번 분석해 보았습니다. 워싱턴 DC에 있는 스미소니언 인스티튜트는 280만 장, 내셔널 갤러리는 5만 장, 메트로폴리탄 미술관은 40만 장, 파리의 미술관들은 연합으로 10만 장, 그리고 구글 아트앤컬처는 70개국, 1200개 문화기관과의 협업을 통해서 600만 장의 이미지를 공유하고 있습니다. 여기에 중국이나 일본, 한국의 아시아의 데이터와 중동 아랍권의 데이터까지 모두 합산한다면 이미 실로 셀 수 없는 만큼의 미술 이미지 데이터가 공유되고 있다라고 말씀드릴 수가 있습니다. 만약 사람이 이 이미지들을 보려고 한다면 하루에 3,000장의 그림을 매일 보아야 1년에 100만 장을 볼 수가 있고 10년이 걸려도 결국 이 온라인에 공유되고 있는 인공지능이 볼 수 있는 이미지를 사람은 못 본다는 이런 결론에 도달하게 됩니다. 이미 온라인에 있는 이미지의 수는 인간의 임계점을 넘어서 있습니다. 그렇다면 인공지능이 이렇게 짧은 시간 안에 학습한 이미지는 시각예술에서 어떤 형태로 현재 발표되고 있을까요? 저는 여기에서 3가지로 분류해 보았습니다. 첫 번째는 시각 예술에서 오는 인공지능의 인지 능력의 향상입니다. 아주 많이 알려져 있듯이 고양이인가 강아지인가를 구별하는 것처럼 사물을 인지하는 것이 첫 번째입니다. 그리고 두 번째는 스타일의 변형이라고 알려져 있는 것입니다. 특히 이것은 서양 유럽 미술사에서 많이 나와 있는 데이터들을 학습한 결과로서 고호풍의 그림이라든가 렘브란트의 그림, 렘브란트 스타일의 그림이라든가 이렇게 초상화 어떤 시각적 이미지를 명화 스타일로 변형해주는 스타일 트랜스포가 있습니다. 그리고 세 번째는 대립신경망, 겐입니다. 전혀 없었던 이미지들을 만들어내고 있습니다. 특히 이 부분에 주목을 하게 됩니다. 실제로 존재하지 않았던 미인의 형태, 사람에게 호감을 주는 얼굴, 혹은 어떤 혐오를 주는 얼굴, 여러 가지 감정을 일으키는 이런 것들을 이미지로 만들어냅니다. 지금은 아직은 가공적이다, 인공적이다, 아직은 사람이 조금 더 감정이입을 하기 어려운 면이 있을지 모릅니다. 하지만 아주 짧은 시간 안에 나도 모르는 사이에 감정을 투사할 수 있는 이런 이미지들이 생성될 것입니다. 그것은 인간의 기쁠 때, 어떤 사람을 봤을 때, 어떤 표정을 봤을 때 굉장히 기쁜가, 어떤 표정을 봤을 때 굉장히 같이 슬픈가, 어떤 표정을 봤을 때 이 사람이 공포감을 느끼는가, 또한 어떤 표정을 봤을 때 나를 이해하고 있다라고 느끼는가, 이러한 표정의 분석이 심화된다면 그러한 표정을 탑재한 얼굴을 만들어내는, 사람을 만들어내는 인공지능이 가능할 것입니다. 이제는 차가운 인공지능뿐만 아니라 따뜻한 인공지능이 가능해지는 것이 바로 우리의 눈앞에 있습니다. 이것은 마치 미술사에서 차가운 추상이 있었다면 또한 인간의 감정을 표현하는 뜨거운 추상이 있었던 것과 같습니다. 이번 대전 비엔날레 2020은 현재의 인공지능의 상황을 보여줍니다. 첫 번째, 인공지능의 인지의 단계가 어디까지 있는가라는 작품입니다. 알베르트 바르케 듀란, 마리오 클랑게만, 마크 마제니트가 만들어낸 나의 인공지능 뮤즈의 작품은 서양 미술사에서 뮤즈로 인식된 작품들을 학습하고 그것을 겐으로 생성된 이미지입니다. 그러나 그것은 아직은 불완전합니다. 그 겐이 만들어낸 이미지는 아직은 정합적이라든가 비율이 맞다든가 그렇지는 않습니다. 그것이 기술의 한계일 수도 있고 혹은 인간이 거기까지 만들어내고 싶지 않은 예술가의 반항, 예술가의 우려일 수도 있습니다. 마찬가지로 신승백, 김용은은 묻습니다. 사람은 인공지능, 특히 얼굴 인식을 통해서 감정 교류를 하려고 합니다. 무엇보다도 안면 인식이 굉장히 중요하다는 것이죠. 그러나 이런 안면 인식의 기술이 인공지능이 모르는, 그러나 인간은 얼굴로 인식하는 그런 어떤 모호한 경계들이 여전히 존재한다는 질문들을 합니다. 이러한 질문들이 공학자에게는 어떻게 보면은 불필요한 과정으로 느껴질 수도 있겠습니다. 왜냐하면 조금 더 빨리 사람들이 좋아하는 겐으로 만들어낸 사람의 얼굴을 만들고 어떤 풍경을 만들고 싶어 할지 모릅니다. 그러나 사람은 그렇게 단정하고 아름답게만 만들어낸 이미지로는 사람의 마음을 움직이기가 어렵습니다. 슬픔이 있기 때문에 기쁨이 있고, 분노가 있기 때문에 즐거움이 있고, 또 공포가 있기 때문에 안정이 감사한 것이고, 또 증오가 있기 때문에 사랑을 알 수가 있는 것입니다. 이런 예술가들이 인공지능의 인지에 대해서 모호한 부분, 그리고 불완전한 부분까지도 학습시켜야 한다, 혹은 학습시킬 수 있다, 혹은 학습시킬 이유가 있다라고 묻고 있는 것일지 모르겠습니다. 다음은 이번 전시에서 두 번째, 인공지능처럼 예술가들이 생각한다는 것은 어떤 것인가? 또 인공지능처럼 창작한다는 것은 어떤 태도인가? 방법의 문제입니다. 여기서는 데이비드 콰이올라가 Remains라는 시리즈에서 인공지능처럼 모든 것을 데이터화한다, 데이터로 학습한다 라는 관점에서 출발한 숲을 데이터화한 것입니다. 숲은 환경이자 자연이자, 특히 유럽에서는 풍경화, 동양에서는 산수화의 전통입니다. 산수화의 전통은 1000년 이상 동안 감정을 다스린 후에 혹은 감정을 자연과 우주에 투사한 예술의 장르이기도 합니다. 콰이올라가 만들어낸 숲을 데이터에서 다시 학습한다라는 것은 인공지능에게 자연을 가르치겠다라는 것으로도 이해할 수가 있습니다. 다음으로 인공지능이 데이터만 있는가라는 표현 방식에 조금 더 물리적인 힘을 가질 필요가 있습니다. 물리적으로 행동할 필요가 있습니다. 이럴 때 팀 보이드는 로봇과 연결을 합니다. 그리고 또 한 가지 다른 것은 무엇이냐면, 그 전에 사람들이 생각했던 예술의 도구들을 바꿔놓습니다. 예술의 재료들이 이제 데이터가 성큼 우리 안으로 들어와 있다는 것을 보여줍니다. 그리고 동시에 이렇게 빨라진 인공지능의 빠른 학습 속도는 인간에게 공포감을 주기도 합니다. 이것은 이미 우리가 3차 산업혁명에서 대량 생산이 가능하면서 느꼈던 것이기도 합니다. 박경근의 1.6초는 이러한 속도감이 주는 공포감에 대해서 묻습니다. 하지만 그의 작품은 굉장히 아름답습니다. 굉장히 시각적입니다. 시각적으로 아주 아름다운 색깔을 사용합니다. 과연 그런 빠른 속도가 다음에 이러한 속도가 너무나 당연한 세대들에게도 공포감일지는 우리가 다시 한번 물어야 합니다. 그러나 인공지능에게 학습을 시키는 것이 과연 좋은 것만 있겠는가? 저는 사람의 감정에 대해서 반드시 낙관적이진 않습니다. 인간의 감정이라는 것은 기쁘고 사랑하고 즐겁고 이런 감정도 있지만, 인간의 분노, 불안, 공포는 더더욱 인간이 나약하게 무너질 수 있는 것이기도 합니다. 이런 불안, 공포를 다스린다는 치안, 어떻게 보면은 불안을 덜어준다는 어떤 치안 이론이 있을 수가 있습니다. 이런 치안, 인공지능이 유리창을 깨는 것을 인공지능에게도 인간이 벌써 학습시키고 있다. 어떤 깨어진 유리창과 깨어지지 않은 유리창을 보여주고 있는 히토시 타이어의 작품은 인간의 내면에 있는 두려움의 부분을 건드리고 있습니다. 당장 이 작품이 인공지능에게 그런 깨어진 유리창까지 불안과 공포의 순간까지 학습시켜야 할 것인가 라는 점을 작가는 묻고 있습니다마는 역으로는 인간의 불안과 감정, 공포까지도 인공지능이 다가올 수 있다라는 것을 보여주는 것이기도 합니다. 그렇다면 인공지능에게 인간의 감정까지 학습시키려고 하고 저는 또 이런 인공지능에게 감정을 학습시키는 것이 중요하며 예술가적 태도가 중요하다고 한다는 것은 어쩌면 염지의 작가가 말했듯이 미래의 열병에 걸려 있는 것일지도 모르겠습니다. 제가 미래의 인간 사회에 조금 더 공헌을 한다든가 미래의 인간 사회를 조금 더 편안하게 한다든가 조금 더 인간의 미래를 발전시킨다라든가 진보시킨다라든가 이러한 미래의 열병에 걸려 있는 것일지도 모릅니다. 하지만 인간은 지금까지도 인류의 문명을 지속해왔고 그 매 순간 매 순간 진보, 진화라는 변화라는 이름들로 조금 더 적응력을 높여왔다는 점을 고려한다면 이러한 미래 열병의 공포, 불안에도 불구하고 우리는 인공지능과 함께 미래를 준비할 수밖에 없는 것이다 라고 제안드리고 싶습니다. 그렇다면 인공지능이 완벽한가 완벽하지 않은가? 현재 인공지능은 많은 오류를 가지고 있습니다. 그렇다고 해서 사람이 안도감을 느낀다라든가 혹은 여기서 멈춘다라든가는 할 수 없다고 생각을 합니다. 항상 인간 자체에도 오류가 있기 때문입니다. 인공지능의 오류는 과학기술의 한계이기도 하지만 인간의 한계이기도 합니다. 인공지능에서 저는 테레사 라이만 더버스의 작품 전망 있는 방에 굉장히 많은 영감을 받습니다. 그리고 여러분들께도 영감을 드리리라 생각합니다. 7가지 제가 칠정으로 표현했던 이런 감정을 넘어서는 것이 많은 심리학자들의 의견에 의하면 어떤 영적인 체험이다. 어떤 초월적인 체험이라고 얘기를 합니다. 그렇다면 인공지능이 초월적인 체험의 이미지까지도 만들어낼 수 있겠는가라는 작품입니다. 예를 들어서 데이터, 메시아의 이미지, 눈에 보이지 않는 메시아의 이미지를 학습한 알고리즘이 메시아의 이미지를 만들어냅니다. 그것은 되게 모호하고 어떻게 보면은 아무것도 제대로 표현하지 않은 이미지일 수도 있습니다. 하지만 작가의 창의성은 그러한 모호한 이미지를 중세시대부터 있었던 어떤 성당의 세로가 긴 스테인글라스 창문의 표현 방식으로 인간에게 다가옵니다. 거기에 챈팅과 같은 소리를 덧입힙니다. 그렇다면 사람들은 나도 모르게 그 방에 들어갔을 때는 인공지능이 만들어낸 알고리즘의 이미지라는 어떻게 보면 완벽하지 않은 오류의 이미지임에도 불구하고 인간은 그 순간 자기 내면 속에 있는 어떤 초월적인 감정의 삼라만상, 칠정, 그 다음에 윤리를 넘어선 어떤 초월적인 경험과 연결될 수도 있습니다. 김영중의 작품을 보여드리고 싶습니다. 김영중의 작품은 인간의 감정이 오히려 개입되지 않는 기계가 만들어낸 차가운 이미지가 오히려 사람들에게는 차분함을 줄 수 있다는 역설을 보여주기도 합니다. 이제는 감정이 오르락 내리락 하는 것이 없이 기계가 만들어낸 변함이 없는 그런 이미지들이 오히려 사람들의 감정을 안정시킬 수 있는 평온함이 연결될 수 있다는 것이죠. 그렇다면 인공지능은 오히려 이런 감정들을 가장 표현하지 않는 예술을 만들어낼 수도 있을 것입니다. 그리고 여기에는 기계가 감정을 조절할 수 있다는 혹은 감정을 조절해야 한다는 신경쇠약과도 연결되기도 합니다. 이처럼 예술가들이 인지하는 것들은 굉장히 복잡다단합니다. 또한 자크 블라스의 무기화된 세트를 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 인공지능이 인간의 감정과 연결된다, 인간의 도덕성과 연결된다, 굉장히 개인적인 측면을 말씀드렸습니다. 하지만 인간의 감정은 사회 속에서도 발현이 됩니다. 인간이 사회적인 동물인 한 인간의 감정은 사회 속에서 공유되고 때로는 인간의 감정이 오류를 일으키기도 합니다. 이런 인간의 감정의 오류는 편견으로 표현이 되기도 합니다. 이런 사회 속에서 인간의 감정이 일으키는 편견을 자크 블라스는 편향성이라고도 표현을 하고, 인간의 편향성은 얼굴을 보고 인공지능이 안면 인식을 할 때 인공지능이 안면 인식을 하면서 여러 가지로 판단내는 것들이 오류가 있을 수 있다라는 것을 이야기합니다. 인간의 감정 역시, 인공지능에게 학습시킨 인간의 감정 역시 많은 오류를 가지고 있을 수가 있습니다. 이러한 오류들, 감정 패턴의 오류들은 정신의학이 인간의 감정을 치유하듯이 우리는 어떻게 보면 감정 AI는 정신의학의 분석에 근거한 그런 어떤 치유와 그 다음으로 가는 인간의 건강한 감정을 학습시키고 또 인간의 건강한 감정을 도와줄 수 있는 도구로서의 감정 AI의 개발이 필요한 것일 수도 있겠습니다. 그래서 마지막은 어떤 동반조로서, 도구로서, 에이전트로서의 AI를 말합니다. 이것은 그전에 예술가들이 보여주었던 인공지능에 대한 불안감, 모호함들과 조금은 다른 것 같습니다. 우리가 매일 일상에서 보는 것들을 공개된 코딩을 통해서 예술로 바꾸어내고, 또 사람들이 만들어내는 모든 데이터들이 예술이 될 수 있다는 것들을 보여주고, 또 그러한 결과가 굉장히 규칙적이고 차분합니다. 그것은 우리가 인류 문명이 맨 처음에 만들어냈던 예술이 굉장히 규칙성과 패턴을 가지고 있다. 그리고 가장 고전 예술이 규칙적이고 패턴, 비율, 이 어떤 인간의 아름다움을 느끼게 했으며, 그것이 아주 모호하고 복잡하고 불안한 감정들을 이성적인 아름다움으로 만들어줄 수 있었다라는 어떤 고전적인 결론과 같을 수가 있겠습니다. 감정을 학습한 인공지능, 그리고 시각예술과 결합된 인공지능은 단순하게 보여지는 것만은 아닙니다. 확장되어 갑니다. 카이스트 미디어랩 이병주 교수 팀의 작품은 촉감과 데이터 그리고 인공지능의 연결의 가능성들을 보여줍니다. 7가지 범주로 분류를 하고 사람이 손을 댔을 때 7가지 데이터들이 나를 인식하게 합니다. 굉장히 심장 박동이 빠를 수도 있고 또 느릴 수도 있고, 내가 그때 굉장히 기분이 좋았을 수도 있고 나빴을 수도 있고, 이런 것들이 데이터, 촉감의 데이터화 될 수 있고, 그것이 사람마다 다르게 표현될 수 있다는 것은 실로 놀라운 일이 아닐 수가 없습니다. 그렇다면 이러한 시각예술을 할 수 있는 인공지능은 여기서 보는 것에서 더 넘어서서 2가지가 결합되어야 된다고 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 첫 번째는 텍스트입니다. 이것은 글로 표현되기도 하고 말로 표현되기도 합니다. 그리고 2번째는 음악입니다. 그래서 많은 인공지능 연구자에게 알려져 있는 것처럼 자연 언어 생성을 활용한 텍스트가 시각예술과 결합되어 감정 AI를 강화할 것을 제안드리고 싶습니다. 감정 AI는 자연 언어 처리와 자연 언어 생성처럼 사람의 말을 이해하고 또 사람처럼 텍스트로 글을 쓰고 말을 하게끔 합니다. 예술가들은 AI에 특히 스토리텔링에 주목합니다. 현재 AI는 사람이 알려준 몇 가지의 키워드와 문장만을 가지고도 문장을 삽시간에 만들어낼 수가 있습니다. 미국의 내러티브 사이언스는 자연 언어 생성으로 플랫폼을 만들었습니다. 그리고 오토메이티드 인사이트는 개인화된 데이터를 축적하여 최적화된 스토리텔링을 만들어줍니다. 현재는 비즈니스나 사업에서 활용되고 있습니다만 곧 개인화된 예술에서도 내 감정에 맞는, 내 감정에 호소하는 스토리텔링을 만들어낼 것입니다. 다음은 목소리입니다. 사람이 글로도 읽지만 사람과 이제 인공지능이 대화를 하는 시대입니다. 내가 좋아하는 목소리로 인공지능이 나에게 이야기를 해주는 것이죠. 특히 우리는 인플루언서에 주목해야 됩니다. 예를 들어서 내 마음에 다가오는 사람의 목소리로 내 마음속의 감정을 움직이는 이야기를 한다면 사람은 마치 나를 가장 잘 이해하는 사람이 나의 감정을 그대로 공감해주면서 이야기를 하고 나의 스토리를 들어준다, 나의 이야기를 들어준다라고 생각할 것입니다. 예를 들어서 굉장히 반항적인 사람이었다면, 영어권에 반항적인 사람이었다면 예전에 제임스 딘이 될 수도 있고요. 또 한국에선 유행하는 펭수처럼 자기 자아가 강한 펭수의 목소리로 학습시킨 인공지능이 너는 괜찮아, 내가 하고 싶은 대로 해 라고 너의 삶은 이런 멋진 이야기야 라고 얘기해 준다면 그 사람의 마음은 동시에 공감을 받았다, 이해를 받았다, 그리고 그 마음이 내가 바로 그 인공지능과 교감했다라고 느낄 것입니다. 바로 이것이 감정 AI의 놀라운 힘이고, 감정 AI가 자연 언어 생성이라든가 언어 텍스트, 음성 AI와 결합했을 때의 힘입니다. 여기에 플러스 눈으로 보여지는 것들이 결합된다면 그것은 실로 어마어마한 엄청난 영향력을 가지게 될 것입니다. 다음은 감정 AI와 시각 예술의 결합에서 음악의 결합까지도 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 이미 인공지능은 내가 좋아하는 음악, 나의 취향을 파악해서 알고리즘으로 내가 듣고 싶은 음악을 추천하는 단계에 있습니다. 그리고 인공지능과 결합된 이런 인공지능 음악은 필요한 음악을 작곡해 주기도 합니다. 슬픈 음악을 교향곡 형식으로 만들어 달라라고 한다면 그에 맞는 음악을, 또 아주 기쁜 음악으로 여러 사람이 함께 들을 수 있는 축하의 음악을 작곡해 달라, 그리고 예를 들면 바이올린 곡을 해달라면 그런 음악을 작곡하고 연주까지 해줍니다. 그것은 기존의 많은 음악의 데이터들 그리고 연주의 데이터들이 있기 때문입니다. 근데 여기서 한 단계 더 나아갈 수가 있습니다. 바로 인간의 감정을 몰입하게 하는 것입니다. 이것을 딥 스페이스 뮤직이라고 부릅니다. 2019년 대전시립미술관에서는 AI 피아노 콘서트를 개최한 적이 있습니다. 몰입형 전시 어떻게 볼 것인가의 한 부분이었습니다. AI가 학습한 피아노 연주를 학습하고요. 기계처럼 정확하게만 치는 것이 아니라 인간의 감정을 표현하는 속도, 강약을 학습시킨 다음에 연주를 합니다. 그리고 이 연주에 맞춰서 디지털 매핑이라고도 하고 데이터 비주얼라이제이션이라고 표현하기도 하고, 최근에는 데이터 스컬프처라고 표현하기도 합니다. 그 음악과 맞는 영상들이 나옵니다. 그러면 사람은 인간의 감정에 다가오는 음악을 들으면서 또한 그 눈으로는 그 음과 교감하는, 그 음의 리듬과 일치되는 것들을 감상하게 됩니다. 이것을 딥 스페이스 뮤직이라고 합니다. 그것은 사람이 나도 모르게 굉장히 증폭되고 불안한 감정들이 만약에 규칙적인 음악을 들었다면, 그리고 눈으로 보이는 패턴들, 데이터 비주얼라이제이션 된 것들이 굉장히 규칙적이었다고 한다면 인간의 감정은 안정이 되고 굉장히 규칙적인 상태가 될 것입니다. 이것을 우리가 굉장히 고전으로 돌아가서 얘기한다고 한다면 그리스 로마에서 굉장히 수학적으로 수와 비율에 맞게 그런 음악을 이 사회를 유지하는 데 사용하려고 했던 반면, 인간이 불안하고 어그러지고 리듬이 맞지 않는 이런 음악들은, 또 그런 예술들은 추방하려고 했던 것과 같은 효과입니다. 그러니까 사람 마음을 안정시키려면 굉장히 규칙적이고 안정된 음악을 보여주고 연주해 줄 수 있다는 것이죠. 그런데 아주 무서운 것은 이와 정반대의 역할도 할 수가 있습니다. 사람들 굉장히 고무시켜야 될 때, 어떤 이성을 넘어서서 공포감을 주어야 될 때도 똑같이 음악을 사용할 수가 있습니다. 불안한 음악, 어두운 음악으로 사람을 공포감에 적게 만들고 굉장히 강한 음악으로 흥분을 시킬 수도 있는 것입니다. 이것은 바로 전쟁에서 사용됐던 음악과 같습니다. 과연 그렇다면 사람들은 인간의 감정을 평온하게 만들어줄 수 있는 것도 가능하고 인간의 감정을 굉장히 불안과 공포로 증폭시킬 수 있는 음악을 학습시키는 AI도 가능하다라는 두 가지 측면을 생각할 필요가 있습니다. 과연 어떤 인공지능을 만들 것인가라는 것은 인간에 대한 이해이기도 하고 인간에 대한 성찰이기도 하고 또 인간 자신에게 묻는 숙제이기도 합니다. 그렇다면 지금까지의 발표를 좀 마무리하고자 합니다. 저는 여기에서 인공지능에게 감정을 학습시킬 필요가 있다. 감정 AI, 그리고 그 감정 AI를 탑재한 예술마저도 가능하다라는 것을 말씀드렸습니다. 인간의 감정은 어떻게 패턴화할 것이냐라는 점에 대해서는 제가 살고 있는 우리나라에서 500년 이상 동안 이론적으로 추구를 해온 7가지 감정, 4가지의 윤리 감정과 7가지의 인간의 감정 패턴에 대해서 말씀드렸습니다. 4가지 윤리 감정의 패턴은 이런 거죠. 불쌍한 것을 측은하게 느끼는 측은지심. 이거는 맞고 틀려 라고 하는 시비지심. 그 다음에 내가 나쁜 행동을 하면 부끄럽다라는 수호지심. 그리고 나를 낮추고 겸손할 수 있고 남을 배려할 수 있는 사양지심을 말씀드렸습니다. 이러한 도덕적인 윤리 감정의 패턴을 인공지능에 학습시킨다면 도덕군자와 같은 AI가 가능하다. 그러나 인간의 7가지 감정은 생각보다 복잡하다라고 말씀드렸습니다. 희로, 애락, 애호요. 희, 기쁨. 노, 분노. 애, 슬픔. 락, 즐거움. 혹은 구, 두려움. 애, 사랑. 오, 증오. 그리고 마지막 욕망입니다. 이러한 감정들은 굉장히 모호하고 복잡하고 인간의 무의식과 연결되어 있고 인간의 마음을 움직이면서 인간을 무너뜨릴 수 있는 영향력과 파괴력이 동시에 있다라고 말씀드렸습니다. 그렇다면 이것을 인공지능에 학습시켰을 때는 인공지능은 아주 강력한 힘을 가질 것입니다. 여기에 더불어서 시각예술이 가지고 있는 시각적인 힘, 그리고 예술가들이 묻는 질문, 그리고 창작의 태도, 방식까지 인공지능에게 학습시킨다면 감정과 예술이라는 2가지의 강력한 것이 이미 장착될 것입니다. 여기에서 저는 미술관 관장으로 있습니다마는 현대 예술이라는 것이 반드시 시각 예술에만 한정되는 것은 아니다. 언어, 텍스트와 같은 것뿐만 아니라 음악까지도 결합된다. 이제는 21세기형 예술이라는 것은 다원 예술이 기본이 될 것이다. 시각, 청각, 그리고 문학과 같은 텍스트, 그리고 촉각, 그리고 앞으로는 향기라든가 모든 오감을 동원하는 예술 형태, 복합된 형태, 다원의 형태가 21세기형 예술이라고 말씀드렸습니다. 이러한 다원 예술일수록 인공지능과 결합될 것이고 또 이러한 인공지능과 결합된 예술이 바로 21세기의 가까운 미래를 열어갈 것입니다. 그렇다면 이런 감정 AI, 예술 AI의 미래는 바로 앞에 와 있기는 합니다. 하지만 한계도 있습니다. 현재는 많은 인공지능의 예술들이 모니터로 보여지는 한계가 있습니다. 이제는 그 표현 방식, 디스플레이 방식이 바뀐다면 그 미래는 새로운 예술의 장르를 열 것입니다. 이제는 미술관에 오지 않아도, 이제는 공연장에 가지 않아도 나의 공간이 나의 맞춤형으로 내가 필요한 곳에서 예술 공간으로 바뀔 것입니다. 그래서 이제는 미래형 디스플레이가 어디에 있을 것이냐, 디스플레이 방식이 어디에 있을 것이냐, 그리고 그것이 경제적으로는 어떻게 사람들이 접근 가능한 만큼의 비용을 낮출 수 있을 것이냐, 혹은 구독과 같이 새로운 소비 형태를 만들 수 있을 것이냐로 바뀔 것입니다. 이제 예술이 예술을 위한 예술이던 시대는 종언을 하고, 이제는 인공지능의 기술로 예술이 일상을 위하고, 예술이 만인을 위하고, 예술이 만인의 감정들이 과학기술의 기반으로 공유가 되고, 또한 공감이 되고, 또한 일상이 될 것입니다. 그리고 여기서 마지막 앞으로의 제안을 한 가지 덧붙이고자 한다면, 이러한 인공지능이 만들어낸 예술, 감정과 결합된 인공지능, 예술과 결합된 인공지능은 인본주의를 추구하기를 바랍니다. 그리고 그 인본주의를 추구하는 과정은 인간의 도전적인 과제입니다. 그러나 우리는 그것을 해낼 수 있으리라 생각을 합니다. 이런 과정에서 우리 예술가들, 그리고 우리의 인문학자들은 공학자들과 함께 더 굳건히, 더 긴밀하게 연결되어서 서로 21세기의 미술을, 21세기의 예술을, 21세기의 문화를 만들어낼 수 있을 것이라고 생각합니다. 이것으로 오늘 제 발표를 마치고자 합니다. 감사합니다.
This is Lev Manovich, and I'm speaking to you from a wonderful exhibition about art and AI. It's a Daejeon Art Biennale, and I'm standing at the Daejeon Art Museum, and I will read to you the first part of my essay called Defining AI Arts, or Defining Artificial Intelligence Arts, 3 proposals. You'll be able to read this article in the book published by Museum, which will be available in bookstores, and also you can find it on the Museum website. On the first site, coming with definition for AI arts doesn't sound hard. AI, I want to remind you, it's abbreviation for longer term artificial intelligence. AI refers to computers being able to perform many human-like cognitive tasks, such as playing games of chess and Go, recognizing content and images in video, translating between languages, selecting best candidates in a job search based on their CVs, and so on. AI is everywhere. In the last few years, it has become part of our everyday vernacular digital culture. So this is how AI has been traditionally understood since its beginnings in the 1950s. So we can extend this concept to the arts. Following this logic, AI art would refer to humans programming computers to create, with a significant degree of autonomy, new artifacts or experiences that professional members of the art world, critics, art historians, curators, would recognize as belonging to contemporary art. So we can say that AI art, something which professional members of the art world agree that it belongs to the genres, it has characteristics, it has qualities of contemporary art. Or we can teach computer skills of artists from early historical periods and then expect that professional art historians would recognize new artifacts the computer creates as possible art from this period. In fact, recently, very talented scientists have created a new work of Rembrandt, where the computer looked at all the different works of Rembrandt and decided that the Rembrandt average painting is a male with particular lighting. The work was 3D printed, and it does very much looks like something Rembrandt could have created. So to me, it really does look like very much a possible work of Rembrandt. In fact, we can go further, and we can also extend the famous Turing test to artificial intelligence art. So if art historians mistake objects a computer creates after it was trained for the original objects, for the original artifacts from some period, and if these objects are not simply slightly modified copies of existing artifacts, such computer pass Turing AI test. In other words, right, we can program AI using deep networks and our technology to create art in the style of particular artist period. And if professional art historians think that this is real, then we can say the computer has passed AI Turing test. Now this sounds very simple and logical. So let's refer to this idea as our first proposal for the definition of AI art. In this definition, art created by artificial intelligence is something that professionals recognize as valid historical art or contemporary art. It sounds simple. Things are not so simple. This logical approach is not sufficient. In fact, on close inspection, its clarity dissolves. For example, there is no commonly accepted definition of art today among the professionals such as art critics, art theorists, philosophers of art, sociologists of culture. The debates, what is art, what is contemporary art, what our culture counts as art, have been going on for decades or centuries, and we don't know. And I think that's why art has a special place in contemporary culture. It's the only thing in our society which is impossible to define. So how can we program a computer to independently create something which we can't even define? Now, the development of modern art during the 20th century involved systematic questioning of the boundaries of what counts as art, even going outside these boundaries. From Marcel Duchamp ready-mades in 1910s to happenings, performances, landworks, installations of 1960s to internet art of 1990s. So in fact, what characterizes modern and contemporary art is that it doesn't follow an accepted definition. It's constantly opening up, exploring, and expanding its boundaries. So the definition is always changing. But to understand what things can expand the boundaries of what counts as art at a given moment in a meaningful way requires the knowledge of our history and development of art into the present. Right? So to actually be able to make a meaningful expansion, to take this is something which we don't count as art, or we don't think of it as artistic object or artistic process, but now we will add it to contemporary art. I mean, you kind of have to study art history, you have to really understand the development of art after this moment to do it. And so far, nobody has tried to program into a computer. So a computer doesn't really understand whatever it's doing. It doesn't have knowledge of history. So instead, most of attempts to use artificial intelligence techniques in the arts relied on usually implicit understanding of art, which was popular before what I would call second modernist revolution of 1950s and 1960s. So I say second because for me the period between 1980s to the end of 1920s, let's say from first exhibitions of Impressionists in Paris to around 1932, early 30s when Bauhaus was closed, when Bauhaus designers had to move to America. I call this the first modernist revolution, the first modernism. In other words, the artists, writers, composers, and computer scientists since 1960s were teaching computers to create objects in the formats that were accepted as art in the modern museums or modern right, society up until late 1950s. So this is very kind of paradoxical, right? Because the attempts to create art of artificial intelligence start in the 1960s. In the 1960s is this period which I call second modernism, when what counts as art is expanded, but instead of teaching computers to create performances, installations, and so on, the computers were taught to create modernist art from earlier decades. So there's a strange paradoxical delay. Right? So from 1960s on, there have been many attempts, many of them successful, to teach computers to create single images, poems, music compositions, and so on. So as I said, by strange coincidence, these experiments in AI arts began at the same time as modern art enters its second revolutionary period, i.e. late 1950s. So while some artists moved beyond art as it existed up until the time, our artists start programming to create a kind of traditional art, objects rather than processes, situations, and performances. And this tendency is still with us. If we look at the most recently, let's say after 2015, works which are celebrated as achievements of AI in visual arts, these are often single images that look like modernist paintings. Perhaps you've heard about style transfer, the technique developed by computer scientists around 1915, where you can take style of one artwork and transfer it to another artwork, or you can take photographs and kind of change them in the style of art. So you're still dealing with single images, and you end up with something which looks like modernist paintings from the beginning of the 20th century. They may deliberately simulate visual appearance of some well-known modern artists, or simply look like some variation of expressionism, cubism, post-impressionism, and so on. If we follow this conservative trajectory, we have to accept that AI arts only simulate the historical art. There has been no attempts, right, not many attempts today to actually make art, to make AI art which will make political statements, which will talk about gender or migration, which in fact would deal with social and cultural issues of our time. Instead, right, lots of artists, designers, and programmers are very happy simulating impressionist and post-impressionist and Fauvism paintings. So, given where we are so far, we have to unfortunately conclude that AI art movement so far was not able to execute the main strategy of modern art, which is constantly expand what counts as art. I think there is one important exception, which is the genre of interactive computer installation that developed in the 1990s. So this work with interactivity, which was very important in the 1990s and 2000s, in fact did expand modern art. And then today we live in a more strange, right, more conservative period where people use neural networks to program modernist images. And the question is why? Why is it interesting? Of course, it's also possible to argue that in the early 21st century, the strategy of expanding art boundaries kind of lost its energy, that we entered the period of pluralism, and the creation of a new, which was so important to modernism, make it new is no longer important. So maybe this idea that art has to be expanded is no longer relevant. Still, I think this doesn't validate my main point. What entered the history as the achievements of AI arts during the last 6 years are usually simulations of historical art created before this AI art would start. So how can we use AI to expand the boundaries of art? How we can use it to create something which is meaningful, but which doesn't exist yet? How we can use it to create art of the future? This to me is perhaps the biggest challenge facing artists, engineers, designers, and curators working with artificial intelligence today in the art context. I'm standing next to a very interesting AI artwork called Non-Facial Portraits. The title itself, Non-Facial Portrait, speaks of a contradiction. If you're making a portrait of a person, and all the portraits in human culture, in Asia, in Europe, Oceania, for thousands of years, always show a human being, usually up front and typically a face. How can a portrait can be non-facial? So the artist collective from Seoul gave certain rules to a number of artists. Their task was to paint the portrait while the AI is watching this painting and try to detect a face. So this is a particular part of AI field called computer vision. Computer vision started to develop already in the early 60s, and in the last decade it became more popular. There is lots of conversations about the use of AI in surveillance, or for example, with social networks can potentially automatically recognize your face and offer to tag you. And artists have also started to use computer vision in some very interesting ways, such as in this artwork. So the artist collective created a set of guidelines and then invited a number of artists to participate, and each of these paintings is a work produced by different artists, and that's why they are different. So the idea was to paint a portrait, and while you're painting a portrait, you have a camera kind of watching it, and you have 3 different AI systems which are continuously looking at this painting in progress, and we're trying to detect a face. So if you look at the small screen, we see video of how this work was developed in progress, and we see 3 rectangles which I keep jumping, and the 3 rectangles with different colors correspond to 3 different AIs, 3 different neural networks which are trying to recognize a face. Okay? So what the artists had to do is to produce something which at the end we feel, right, represents a face, but not the face, right, to the AI system. So this ambiguity is very interesting because in fact this ambiguity between abstraction and representation, a kind of diagram and realism, is at the heart of modern art. So think about development of modern art, which is typically narrated through a kind of Western tradition. In fact, what was going on in Paris, from Impressionism, Monet, Renoir, Sisley, and so on, to Post-Impressionism, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and then Matisse, Picasso, Sonia Delaunay, right? And then by 1912, 1914, we reach full abstraction with Francis Kupka, again Delaunay, Mondrian, Malevich, and other artists, right, working in Moscow, Paris, Berlin, Prague, and so on. So within this period between 1907 and 1914, right, modern art moves very decisively, very quickly from realism to abstraction. But what happens next? So I think what happens next, up until today, right, is that lots of artists, in fact millions of artists, explore the space between kind of full realism, perhaps what we can call photorealism, something which AI systems have been trained to work with, right? So AI systems have been trained in the industry and in research labs to recognize faces, and full abstraction. And if we look, in fact, at the 20th century art through a lens of this artwork, we realize that this ambiguity, right, where it's a face but maybe not a face, maybe it looks like a face to the artist but doesn't look like a face to you, maybe one viewer thinks it's a face, another viewer thinks it's something else, right? So this kind of balancing act, right, on the boundary, right between where something becomes recognizable and then the next second it becomes unrecognizable. It's exactly the kind of spectacle, the drama, the narrative of 20th century art. And we kind of know that, right? We think about it, but maybe we forget. So one of the things I like about this artwork is, first of all, it does involve painting. So very directly it speaks to us to the modern art tradition. But it also reminds us and makes it understand how this balancing act is in fact at the heart, right, of 20th century art. And when I think about my favorite 20th century artists, in fact, we very much fit into this category. So people like Chaim Soutine or Francis Bacon, right? They paint with landscapes or still lifes or pieces of meat in the case of Soutine, but we also use different devices to make these things almost unrecognizable. Especially Francis Bacon, a British artist who was working after a war, after Second World War. So he would paint portraits of people, and then he would take a cloth and fill it with paint and kind of throw it onto the portrait, precisely to erase, right, kind of photorealism, to make it less recognizable. So again, I think this artwork is very rich. I think I can imagine artists doing more. Like I would like, for example, them to use this system and to ask artists to paint still lifes or landscapes or maybe some kind of painting about Korean history. And then the AI in a way forces them, right? So the AI forces them, the AI is teaching them how to be modernist artists, right? How to have this balancing act between representation and non-representation. It's wonderful. If you can get to the museum, please see it in person, because you see the texture, the canvas, all the details. But if not, please at least look at these artworks at the museum website. I'm standing in front of a wonderful, mysterious, sensitive, sensual, thought-provoking, and simply beautiful work by the artist Cuyola. He often works with landscapes. He uses a variety of modern computer and analog technologies, sensors, AI, computer vision, and so on. It's quite unusual to see this work today in an exhibition about art and technology. It's big, it has this monumental presence, which I think in the context of Daejeon and Korea speaks to both East and West. It reminds me of the traditional Asian scroll paintings, which are often monochromes, with screens, but also Western, let's say, paintings of the Renaissance, of Jesus, Madonna, our Christian subjects, also perhaps a cathedral windows. And the subject of this work is nature. So to create this work, the artists have used 3D scanning technology and scanned parts of a forest, and then manipulated the scan to create these beautiful, very subtle, monochrome, black and white representations. Now, this scanning technology is used more and more frequently in everyday visual culture. First of all the smart cars now have it. So the smart car, in order to navigate by itself without human driver, it needs to understand the world, it needs to see the road in front of it. So it has a few different cameras, including this kind of camera, which is basically shooting signal and then measuring how long it takes for the signal to get back, similar to radar and similar to how dolphins, for example, also navigate in their environment, and creates this 3D representation. So if you shoot this signal, in a room or our rectangular construction, you will get perfect rectangular surfaces, but because the trees have all this infinite fractal-like details, you get a bit of a noise. But in contrast to many other artists, Kyola, he doesn't make a kind of spectacle, right? A carnival of noise. He keeps it to a minimum, and he really wants us to admire the delicate complexity of trees. When I walk in the forest, and Korea is a beautiful place to enjoy nature because 80% of the country is mountains with forests. So every week I go to a forest and enjoy, how trees change. Now we're in October. I think about variability of nature. To me, every tree, every branch, every leaf looks unique. And I don't think with human culture, in any period, in any geographic region, has ever reached this uniqueness. So think about the ornament. Ornament always repeats. Even, of course, you get the modern period, you get the Bauhaus and Futimas, where modern architects and designers refused ornament and started to create buildings which consist from white cubes. In fact, modern museum is the essential, right, the kind of perfect realization of modern idea of a white cube. Nature doesn't have white cubes. Nature is not geometric, or rather it combines geometry and curvature, and nature seems to us to have infinite detail. Every leaf, every tree is different. And that's why I think we're drawn to nature. That's one of the reasons, and that's also why I'm drawn to this wonderful work. Another thing which I want to mention is that, in fact, in the modern tradition, in the modern Western tradition, the development of landscape paintings, the representation of landscape, is connected to technology. So think about French Impressionists working in Paris and around France in 1870s and 1880s. They were quite influenced by the science of their times, by the new emerging discipline of experimental psychology. So in fact, when you think Impressionism, that was also new media, that was also art and science. A post-impressionist Seurat was very much influenced and inspired by the new studies in experimental psychology. And in fact, he used a special instrument to figure out the lines, the orientation of lines, the angles of lines in his paintings, because he thought that by controlling the orientation of lines, he can have viewers of his paintings feel particular emotions. And in the case of Impressionists, right, they were also influenced by psychology and physics of light and color. So as you know, they often mixed and used kind of pure, very bright colors in their paintings. So if you come very close to their paintings, right, it's mosaic of open, very saturated colors, but when you step back, these colors get mixed up and you get this complex kind of shining surfaces. So I think it's interesting, right, that we think about today art and technology as something artists do using contemporary technology, computers, with three-dimensional scanners, AI. But in fact, the history of all human art, it's always about materials, it's always about technology. Whether it is cave paintings produced tens of thousands of years ago, right? So we're using material of a cave as a medium, or use of parchment, paper, engravings, etchings. So in fact, probably the majority, if maybe all famous artists, architects, and designers who we remember, in fact, were experimenters and became new media artists and really did a breakthrough with new technologies over time. So for example, works in the 1930s, 1930s in Europe, experiment with photography, X-rays. We use the new reportable Leica cameras, which allow photographers to get very close to their subject. So I think it's very useful to think of this art and technology movement. It's not something which is very recent, but in fact occupied human beings for tens of thousands of years. So in that context, I like this work, right? It makes a very strong connection, very deliberate connection to the history of representation, to the history of landscape art. As I said, it's monochrome. There are this vertical scroll, which reminds me of monochrome tradition of Asian art, the scrolls and the screens. And I think this verticality, to me, it's more Asian than the more landscape, more horizontal tradition of Western painting. And I also like that it's not a triptych. We have a number of parts, and there is something monumental about it. And I think this monumentality, this work, right, this large size prints, contrasts with ephemerality, right, with kind of fleeting nature of nature, where every week I go to a forest and every week, it changes, right? The trees become yellow and then red and then bare, the shapes of leaves change, the leaves fall down, they're no longer this kind of green, beautiful flowers, but they become brown skeletons of former selves. And also, as I said, there is this beautiful noise which is kind of floating around this landscape like a kind of insects or butterflies, which in fact is the artifact of a scanning process. It's a beautiful work, and I can look at it forever, and I love it very much. I'm sitting in front of a work which has a relatively long name, Machines on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, Imprinting. You may remember that there was a wonderful movie by Almodovar, a famous Spanish director, Woman on the Edge of a Nervous Breakdown, but here we have very simple machines. We can classify this work as artificial intelligence art, but we can also call it artificial life art, and it comes as a part of a series of decades of work in this area by scientists, engineers, and artists, where we have few machines or maybe a few very simple elements. So think about game of life. Each element, each object or each machine is programmed to have few very simple rules. And then you set the system and you kind of watch the system. I think the first work in this long trajectory was Game of Life. I think it was from 1942. And then in the 1950s, a computer scientist at MIT has also built already these kinds of machines. And then in the 1980s, we have popularity of a new movement in AI called artificial life, and so on and so forth. I don't know exactly how these objects were programmed, but I suspect that there are a couple of simple rules. So first of all, we're moving, and then we get to the edge of this artificial world. We're trying to get out, right? So if you get stuck, you can watch from sometimes for 10 minutes, trying to figure out how to move. And then we have a special character, right? A protagonist of our story, which is this machine with this yellow kind of eye or yellow head, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like it's programmed to be obsessively chased forever until the stuff comes and have to change the battery, this white machine. And what I find fascinating about it is how much meaning, emotion, drama in history, we can project into this very, very simple rudimentary machines. I think we have less intelligence when you're a robotic vacuum cleaner, which many of us use to clean our homes, and yet we humans project so much. It's the same thing. Like if you see an object which is round, and producers of consumer electronics or furniture often on purpose make edges round, there's something inside us, a kind of programming which goes back to billions of years, which makes us think that with animals, way of life, we have this anthropomorphic dimension. And here, this billion-year-old instincts or programming inside our nervous system gets activated even more, because these machines move around, and for us, something which is moving is alive. And it probably also feels alive and biological, because we don't move in a straight line like a cow airplane. In fact, if you notice, look closely, we're kind of staggering. So in fact, we are machines at the age of a breakdown. And there is also here a story about something which, at least in the modern culture, millions of books, movies, theater plays, video games are all about, which is love and not a happy life. Because if you have a happy life, it doesn't make for an interesting movie. The movie would only last 5 minutes. It's about obsession. When you're kind of obsessed with something, or you like somebody, or you almost have a fetish for somebody, but the person never notices you. And I think I remember, my own life when I was very young. Like, I really liked somebody. I very much liked a particular girl, but I was too shy to even call her. And of course, she had no idea that I was so interested. And I was thinking about her for years. And maybe we do this on purpose, right? Because we realize that if we get very close to our object of love, object of attention, suddenly this magical feeling is going to break down, and we have to deal with reality of a complex person. And this is exactly what we see here, right? So this white machine has, I think, no idea that this yellow machine is obsessed with her or with him, right? You can project any gender you want. And there is this following, which never ends. And there is also this strange staggering. And you may think that this machine is staggering because maybe it starts feeling that somebody is looking at it, or maybe somebody loves her, or maybe it's simply programmed to stagger, again, to look a bit less linear, less mechanical. And again, I'm thinking about human beings, I'm thinking about Freud, the inventions of unconscious, Lacan, psychoanalysis, neurosis, psychosis, how on one hand they're so rational, we make computers, we make AI, we make bridges, we open museums, and yet our behavior is driven by certain obsessions, certain loops, which may go to hundreds of millions or billions of years old. And this combination of rationality and irrationality, decision-making and obsessive behavior is maybe what makes us humans and what makes us so interesting and mysterious to each other. I can watch this forever. And again, this is, I think, why this work, and it's a very good example of work in this longer tradition, is so successful, because in a way it shares the key characteristics of our modern art. Is the artist can do something very complex, something very ambiguous, out of nothing. Again, think about Malevich, black square or white square, right? Just a square on the canvas. Think about minimalism or structuralist art from the 1960s, right? Can be just a few lines or a few drops. So there's incredible simplicity here, but the simplicity generates endless complexity, because each of these 4 characters move in their own trajectories, with trajectories change, and we project the idea that there are these complex behaviors, we have plans. In reality, we may be moving randomly. So we can say that perhaps this is a kind of minimalist artificial life work, right? It creates a whole artificial world out of just few elements, a few rules, and this is fascinating. And that's why, to me, it's not only AI art, but it's also a good art, and in fact, it's a kind of good modern art.
Hello and welcome to this presentation about AI-based music composition. My name is Ali Nikrang. I am a co-researcher and artist at Ars Electronica Future Lab in Linz, Austria. I have my background in computer science, but also in classical music. And in this presentation, we will talk about AI-based music composition systems and how they work. And we will discuss their fascination, but also limitation and challenges that come with these kind of models. Let's start with an example, with a piece of music that is composed by Richard Carr. The piece of music we just heard was composed by an AI system called Richard Carr. This is the system I'm currently working on, and it is able to compose music that sounds, I would say, natural and human. And I think we would also agree that the piece of music we just heard sounded emotional, and somehow it wasn't really possible to say if it was composed by an AI system, by machine, or by a human composer. It was trained with 25,000 pieces of music, mainly classical music. And the task was simply to learn how to compose music that sounds human and natural and emotional, but does not exist in the training set, of course. The actual task during the training was much simpler. It was just to predict the next note. What does it mean? It means all what the model had to learn was to predict the next note given the previous notes. So it means the context, we can consider the context as previous notes, and the model had to learn to predict the right next note. Let me give you an example. Consider this motif. Actually, it is very likely that the next note would be a C. So it would sound. So the model should, for example, learn to predict the C at that place. So it is actually very similar to how natural language processing models are trained. What they have to learn is also to predict the next word given previous words. Of course, they don't work with notes. They have to learn words from the natural language, and they predict the next word given the words that occurred previously in the document. Consider the sentence, today is a sunny day. And we want to predict the last word, day. Of course, the model has to know today is a day, and a day can be sunny, and so it is very likely that the last word is day. So generally, the basic idea behind training models, training AI models with this concept is, if you have a model that is able to generate or to predict the next word given previous words, or in the case of music, to predict the next note given previous notes, so the model must have learned some essential understanding of the data with which it has been trained. In the case of grammar, in the case of language, it would mean grammar, of course, and it would mean the meaning of the words and the relationships of the words to each other. In the case of music, it would mean the rules of harmony, the music theory, and of course how the nature of music is. there are words that are very predictable. For example, today is a sunny day. The word is at the second position is of course very predictable. It could be was, of course, or today has, but the sentence would continue in a different way. But those words are very predictable because of the rules of the grammar. But there are also words or positions in a text. This is open. It is open how the sentence will continue. For example, today is a beautiful Monday would also be correct. But we have some kind of new information if we use the word Monday. So interestingly, we have a similar situation also for music generation. In music, there are moments that are highly predictable. For example, the ends of the phrases, or the resolution of dissonant harmonies. So at those moments, we have to be predictable because otherwise it would be very likely perceived as mistakes or something that doesn't really fit to the music. But on the other hand, if everything is predictable, the music, the result would be very boring because there is no creativity in it. So on those moments, the model has to be somehow creative and unpredictable. They are open. We don't know how the music will continue. And those moments are actually the moments that are essential to make real art or to make something that sounds interesting. Let me give you an example. Consider this piece of music composed by Johann Sebastian Bach. This moment, what comes here, is actually not really predictable because we have a modulation. But this is exactly where art happens because we don't know how the music will continue. And it continues actually in a way that was not really predictable. Somehow predictability and creativity are opposed to each other because if something is predictable, it can't be creative, right? And this is exactly the challenge for AI-based music composition system to know where they can be predictable and they has to be predictable and where they have to be, creative or they have to compose something that wasn't really expected. I think I would agree that this piece of music also sounds very natural. And it is, again, not possible to say if it was composed by an AI system or by a human composer. The question that arises here is actually, how should we call the result? What is the meaning of the output? Can we call it art? I think the problem is the intention. To create meaning, to create art, to create anything, we need the intention to create. Even the very first cave painting in human history were intentional because the artists wanted to communicate a meaning with the society. And even today, we can understand the meaning of the hunting scenes, for example. And I think to create art, we also need the intention. One might argue that there are pieces of music, especially in the modern music, where the artists make a huge use of randomness, and something that is random can't be intentional. Of course, but on the other hand, even the randomness as a concept is intentional in that pieces of music. And intention, if we agree that intention is something that we need to create art, is of course something that AI system cannot give us. Let's assume we have solved all the technical issues, and let's assume we have the perfect AI system that can compose music of highest possible quality, however it is defined, by just pressing the compose button. What is the personal meaning of the output? How can we personalize the output, and how can we express ourselves in the result? So it is exactly the limitation and the problem with AI composed music, even if it is perfect, actually. And I think that the answer to give a meaning to this result is collaboration. Without collaboration, of course, we can use the result of AI system as a huge library of non-existing pieces of music, because it's endless, and every time we press the button, it would compose a new piece of music for us. But with collaboration, actually, we can compose something that has a meaning, that has a personal meaning, because it was our intention to create something new. And collaboration means using AI as counterpart and not as a tool like it is nowadays. So, AI systems are trained with huge amount of data, and they learn their own assumptions about the data, and they learn and develop their own perspective on data. And human artists, of course, have another perspective on data, because they are humans, and they perceive the music in a different way, of course. And the goal is to bring those two perspectives together so that it is beneficial for both, so that that we can compose something that sounds natural, that sounds emotional, and is personal, and we can use the power, the ability of AI system to deal with such huge amount of data to improve and to extend our own creativity. And this is exactly the idea behind Richer Car. So we are investigating new ways of interaction and collaboration between human artists and AI systems. Let me show you an example of how we can compose music with Richer Car. As soon as we press the compose button, the model offers us 5 different ways to start the piece. We take this suggestion and let the model continue by just pressing the compose button again. The model gives us again 5 different ways to continue. Let's check some of them. We take this version and continue. We can again play different possibilities and decide for one of them. We take this alternative and continue with the composition. The result can be exported as a MIDI file and be performed on digital instruments. Can of course also be performed by human musicians. Ricerca means in its Italian origin search. So actually it refers to a musical form of Baroque and Renaissance, and composers use this term to find out the potential of a theme or of a musical idea or a structure. And I think it fits very good to the idea of AI-based music composition. Because together with human artists, we can explore the musical universe, and we can take different alternatives from the AI system, and we can even change the notes, and we can move in this universe of different possibilities, and we can take different paths. And therefore, I think Ricerca as a term fits very good to the idea of exploring the musical universe.
안녕하세요. My name is Pierre, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Ava. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how AI can create music. So 4 years ago, I watched this science fiction film called Her, which features Samantha. Samantha is a super intelligent form of AI that cannot take physical form like you and I. Instead, when she is spending time with her loved one, she writes pieces of music that she calls musical photographs to capture the moment of her life that she's spending with her loved ones. As a musician, an engineer, and someone who was raised in a family of artists, I thought that this idea of musical photographs was really, really powerful. And this is what inspired me to create an AI music composer. Her name is Ava, and she's an artificial intelligence that has learned the art of music composition by reading thousands of scores from different musical styles, ranging from classical music, symphonic music, cinematic music, all the way to jazz, electronic. And the way that we teach Ava about music is basically by having Ava look at musical patterns. So musical patterns and repetition is what grounds the listener and allows him or her to really feel like the music has a sense of purpose. And these are the type of musical parameters and patterns that Ava will look for in a score are basically things like melody, harmony, rhythm, orchestration, musical development, all of those things. And by learning all of those things and how all of these different patterns interact with each other, this is how Ava is able to learn how to write a good piece of music. The second thing that we teach Ava is basically about musical constraints. So in music, there are certain constraints that can be of a physical nature. For example, certain instruments sound louder than other instruments. And they can also be a stylistic constraint. So for example, Chinese music tends to be only written in pentatonic scale. So it's by teaching this additional constraints of music that we can teach Ava to write idiomatically for certain instruments, for certain styles, and also ensure that a piece of music is well written and can be performed by human musicians. So once we've taught Ava about both musical patterns and musical constraints, Ava can sort of assemble all of those rules that it's learned into a mathematical model that it will then use in order to create totally original music. But there's still one challenge that remains, and it's this. With other tasks that AI can do, like classifying images, for example, it's very easy to define whether the AI is performing well at its task or not. For example, if the AI has been trained to classify images of cats from images of dogs, it's very easy to tell if the AI has performed badly by mislabeling the image of a cat as an image of a dog. But music is a highly subjective art, and it's really hard to define how what defines a high-quality piece of music. So what we do in order to overcome this problem is basically ensure that Ava writes the right piece of music for the right person, because all of our tastes are different. And the way we achieve this is basically by showing or giving Ava one piece of music that we like. For example, if I like the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, I can give the score to Ava. Then Ava will look for interesting patterns in this particular score and some patterns that really define the score, and we'll try to create a novel piece of music that sounds similar to the original, shares some of the patterns, some of the characteristics of the original piece of music that I provided, but is still sufficiently different in order to qualify as original. It's this approach to personalized music creation that allows us to respond to very specific requirements. For example, 2 years ago, we had a project where Ava was commissioned to create a totally original piece of music, but that would be reminiscent of an existing film. Record Among the Stars, that's the name of the piece, in Hollywood studios. The piece was conducted by John Beale, and I would like to show you to you now.
2, 3, 4, 5.
As you've seen in this video, AI can create beautiful pieces of music. But the best part is not that. It's that humans can actually be the ones who perform and bring those pieces to life. And it's not the first time in history that technology enhances humans' ability to create great music. When silent films first came around, live music was almost always used as a way to enhance the experience of the viewer by having a couple of musicians playing music in an otherwise silent viewing. But the problem is that this solution wasn't really scalable. I mean, it's really hard to cram an entire symphony or dozens of people into every cinema of the world because some cinemas are small. So when music recording was invented, it was a game changer, and it was an enhancer of creativity and of experience for two reasons. The first one is it allowed filmmakers to have access to a personalized soundtrack that would be fitted to each and every frame of their movie. The second reason was that the audience could have basically a full orchestra, a symphonic orchestra, during the viewing of their film, regardless of where they are in the world. There was another game-changing event in the history of music, and that was the invention of the synthesizer. And synthesizers really allowed humans to get access to a totally new range of sounds that didn't exist in nature or didn't exist with acoustic instruments. And this really enhanced people's creativity to the point where new musical genres were invented, like electronic music. 4 years ago, when I watched the science fiction film Her, I thought to myself that the next single biggest change in how we consume and create music would be personalized music. Nowadays, we have access to an increasingly large amount of content that's created every day. For example, video games are increasingly interactive. You can have branching storylines. The player can have actually decisions over how the story evolves in the game. And there's hundreds of hours of these highly interactive stories in those video games. But yet, there's only 2 hours of music. So it means that music loops over 50 times, and it's not a very immersive experience, and it's quite frustrating, frankly. So what we're working on is basically a way for Ava to create highly personalized music for interactive content like video games, so that those type of content can have access to hundreds of hours of music for their soundtracks. But we don't just want to do this for games. As a matter of fact, we think it's a really exciting thing to imagine if we could bring back certain composers to life. For example, Beethoven, and if he could be sitting just next to me, writing a piece of music for my personality and my life story. Or imagine if someone like Martin Luther King had access to a personalized AI composer. Then maybe we would remember I Had a Dream not only as a great speech, but also as a great piece of music that encompasses Dr. King's ideals. And this is our vision at Ava, to personalize music so that each and every one of us can have access to a personalized live soundtrack of our own. And not only do we think that more music is good for the world, but we also think that Ava can help as an assistant people to create music without necessarily having access to the money required to buy all of the software and hardware necessary to create music, but also don't actually have the time to go through years of musical education. I hope you enjoyed this presentation of Ava. If you want to find out more information, you can check out our website, www.ava.ai, and I thank you for your time.
I am very happy to invite you to our international colloquium. And then I have several questions and then the topics which I want to discuss. But I chose one of a few major questions. And do you think artificial intelligence impact art world and now and in the future?
That's a very good question, and we can talk about it forever, but let me try to give you a shorter answer. In the last decade, artificial intelligence started to impact our everyday life. Neural networks are used for search, for book recommendations, movie recommendations. We're used by companies to customize their products. Netflix used AI to decide on the kind of plot and details of Game of Thrones. So AI is everywhere. And to the extent that contemporary art reacts to everyday life, it also indirectly reacts to this new artificial intelligence society. In addition, many artists use computers, algorithms, AI to create artworks. The art market is also using AI to try to predict the next hot artist, perhaps to recommend buyers what to buy. So just as AI entering many realms very quickly, education, agriculture, and so on, it's also entering the realms of art in many different ways.
And then I think artificial intelligence is quite widely spread and impact our daily life and some artists. But some artists ask questions. Artificial intelligence seem or look very dry and cold. But sometimes I feel some emotions. Sometimes I want to teach emotions to artificial intelligence. Because we are the human beings, our emotions is very diverse and big. But do you think artificial intelligence can understand or can learn our emotion like human beings?
I think, first of all, that your question and your intuition is absolutely precise and on target. So far, we have been programming our computers for decades to only kind of simulate or to help human being as a cognitive animal, right? The original definition of AI was to make computers which can kind of simulate high cognitive functions. They can play chess, they can solve problems, they can translate. But human being is not only about brain, it's about emotion, it's about feelings, it's about all kinds of psychological states. And that really was outside of the goal of computer scientists. And I think the same thing we see today. So when we use computer for search, for recommendations, or maybe the computer tries to understand how we type on the keyboard of a new phone, it tries to optimize it, it's only about the human being as a rational being. And I think just as economics and in social science in general, I may be giving too much focus on the cognition and not enough on emotions. Maybe the engineers and computer scientists have started to try to think about human being as a more complete, more multidimensional, right, kind of creature, and we kind of want our machines in some kind of ways to deal with emotions. I think what happens today is that the machines are cold, the machines are very rational, we optimize to save time, but it is we human beings, who spend lots of time with machines and engage them physically, such as I engage with my phone, but we project emotions into them. So we develop these emotional feelings for our cars, for our laptops, for our tablets, for our phones. Like for example, I kind of want to go buy a new phone because my phone is 2 years old, but I'm so attached to this phone, to its shape, to where icons are, and I think of it as a human being, right? As a complex emotional creature, even though it's not. So we're already projecting emotions onto the computers, and maybe in the future, the computers will become more emotional. So in fact, this emotional artificial intelligence, which you hint at, is I think very likely to become the next frontier, the next paradigm in AI research and our interaction with machines.
Yes, it is the emotional attachment to my phone or emotional attachment to machine is very interesting point, both to our daily life and to artists. And the new frontier, and maybe it might be artificial intelligence, it might be machines, it might be computers. I can say many words, many words pop up in my mind. But if I summarize the kind of words or kind of technology of 21st century, and just the 21st century, what kind of technology or how technology kind of explore the new future to artists or to art world, or just how can we interact this kind of new experience of emotional attachment to the machine and to technology?
I think that traditionally human arts in different civilizations, different periods, have dealt with emotions. We admire Renaissance portraits, works by Dürer or Rembrandt, which represents the human being in its complexity. The work of modernist artists of the 20th century, Francis Bacon, Picasso, Giorgio O'Keeffe, also speak about emotions. But to me, in the 1980s, lots of modern art made this turn towards cognition, where artwork becomes a kind of semiotic object and you have to decipher it to get some message. So at some point, I think modern art in a way stopped talking about emotions and became very cognitive. So where do we find the range of emotional expressions today? Actually, we find it more in popular arts, in fashion, because fashion speaks to the whole body, right? Texture, volume, and so on. We find this in movies, in TV dramas, which are all about emotions, life, despair, passions, and so on. So in a strange way, today I think many artists deal with only kind of political, social topics, and they only address human being as the kind of cognitive being. And it is popular culture which deals with emotions. And I think it's a kind of missed opportunity for contemporary art. So I would like contemporary artists to engage with human being, again, as a kind of 360-degree way, and use AI in the same way, use AI to provoke emotions, to maybe create new emotions which don't exist, to express, capture, provoke multitude of feelings. What kind of feelings I have when I go to different spaces, when I go to nature, different weeks in the fall, the feelings which I have when I go to different cafes. Always physicality affects me, and I'm not feeling only 7 basic emotions, but I'm feeling lots of different emotional states, and I see 20th century art, painting, sculpture, poetry, and so on, representing these emotional states. And I think AI should be able to do at least the same, but more. So I want AI to invent new emotions for us, and to provoke new emotions, and to extend what it means to be a human being in the 21st century.
Yes, I think the new emotions is, I have to welcome this kind of new emotions in this period. And then just today, we can just see some artist works together, and then some artworks that connect the traditional long history of the tradition of long art history, like a landscape painting, and some kind of works inspire our emotional attachment. It is such a variety in artificial intelligence, or just art with artificial intelligence. If we cannot define what is the art with artificial intelligence precisely, but if we have to define temporarily what is the artificial intelligence art or the age of artificial intelligence art.
Sure. So, lots of people today are thinking about these questions. We're thinking, can computer be really creative? Can computer invent something new? But if I'm to try to make a very short definition, or at least kind of define a terrain of conversation, I would say that for me, art which engages with artificial intelligence, it means that the artist gives up some of control. So some of control goes to the machine, and in the early period, 60s and 70s and 80s, the artists would program a computer, so using very simple algorithms, but they would put some randomness, and then what you see was a kind of co-creation of computer and the artist, and today you can do it through neural networks and other techniques, and I think this ability to give up control and to co-create with a machine is perhaps the single most important characteristic. And the question is how to use it imaginatively, how to use it in an interesting way, not to simply create variations on the topic, but to really, in a way, do it also as a way to reflect what it means to be human. Because today, as we talk, we're so much dependent on our machines. We delegate to machines, to the web, our memory. We kind of delegate our calendars to Google or to our phone. And this delegation of kind of human identity to machine is basically what it means to be human today. And I think art kind of in a way has to do the same. So if we delegate some of our creative control to the machine, Right? Perhaps we can reflect this new human being, because that's what human beings already do in their everyday life.
Now just I understand artificial intelligence more deeply in diverse ways. But some people doubt artificial intelligence might meet the third winter, like the past two winters. We can be positive to the future of artificial intelligence in culture area, or we we can expect some negative future in artificial intelligence art.
Yes, so I think you're referring to so-called a winter, in fact, a couple of winters, and that's the history of artificial intelligence, which begins in the 50s. So in the first years, people were very enthusiastic, and they famously thought that they can solve a problem of computer vision or computer understanding of language like in the summer or a few years, and it didn't happen. Even funding was withdrawn. And then since about 10 years ago, there is lots of success of using deep neural networks. So we have this artificial intelligence summer, and there is lots of hype. The media, the celebrities, the governments also use this hype to scare people. Will machine take over? Of course, it's a completely meaningless proposition, because in fact there is no artificial intelligence. There are just computers which we program, and we can always pull the plug. But I'm quite shocked by how many millions of people are really afraid of it. We should be afraid of other things, like bad presidents, corruption, global warming, as opposed to being afraid of computers. But some computer scientists in the last few months actually do talk about perhaps not winter, but perhaps new fall coming, because there is so much hype surrounding AI. And people think that sooner or later we will realize that this new paradigm of deep neural networks also has limits. And also, let's face it, right? We don't have general artificial intelligence. The computers don't really understand anything. So far, we have successes in very particular areas, like recognizing content of images, for example, translating voice into speech, translating between languages, medical diagnostics, and even in all these areas, the computers make mistakes. So we don't have artificial intelligence. We have very particular local intelligences, and I think once more people understand it, we may have a kind of not AI winter, but AI fall. And maybe we'll have some kind of AI fall in digital art as well. We'll see, because also there's lots of excitement about artists using computers. And I remember, like the early period of new media art, the 90s, where whenever you meet an artist or somebody who is really interested in computers and art, you think it's a wonderful person. So everybody around me in this my field look amazing, and now look at these artworks, most of them were not so amazing. So I think eventually we start wanting to have quality and something which would last, something which has meanings, simply outside of using the latest technology.
Wow, thank you so much. And I can we will see what is the future of artificial intelligence in art and digital art world.
So I want to thank you. I want to thank your wonderful staff, young curators, everybody working in the museum, for mounting this very impressive biennale with, I think 17 or 18 artworks, and having this experiment and really asking these questions, because if artists and cultural institutions don't ask the most difficult questions, we have no reason to exist. And the critical attitude of many of these artworks is important, because our media, right, our popular press, and scientists themselves love to celebrate AI, love to say that it's life-changing. And I think we have to be critical, and we have to ask difficult questions. And you can say, and that's maybe going to be my other definition of AI art. AI art is art which asks the most difficult, the most challenging questions about humans, technology, simulation, and so on. It asks questions as opposed to simply creating a kind of beautiful aesthetic experiences.